In the spring of 2009, a man named Dale Pruitt drove out to the old Kessler Mill on County Road 14 in Garfield County, Kansas, and stood in the gravel lot with a clipboard pressed to his chest. He was 43 years old, an extension agent with Kansas State's Agronomy Division, and he had driven 40 minutes from the office in Larned because someone on the county board had asked him to have a look. A woman had just paid $38,000 for the property. He wanted to understand why. The mill had been idle since 1994. The stone grinding mechanism inside was a 1911 French burr installation, two paired quartzite wheels, each 52 inches across, set on a timber frame that had been greased and adjusted by the same family for 3 generations before the last Kessler retired and the building went to weeds and pigeons. The buyer was a woman named Nora Hatch, 37 years old, who had been leasing 12 acres outside of Burdett for 2 seasons and growing a portfolio of open-pollinated wheat varieties that Dale, in his assessment, characterized as a hobbyist's collection. She had no milling experience. She had no commercial distribution contacts. She had, as Dale wrote in his notes that afternoon, standing in the parking lot with a pigeon cooing somewhere in the rafters above him, a romantic attachment to obsolete technology that was going to cost her everything she had put in. 14 years later, in January of 2023, a regional food distributor in Kansas City placed an order for 11,000 pounds of Nora's stone-ground heritage flour in a single purchase. That order was the third of its kind in 6 weeks, and it came with a waiting list of 32 independent bakeries who had been told they would need to hold their names until spring allocation. Let me tell you what happened in between. Nora Hatch grew up in a house that smelled like bread. Her grandmother, Edith Vargas, had come to Kansas from Chihuahua in 1952 with her husband, who worked the grain harvest circuit, and she had brought with her a notebook of recipes in handwriting so small, and even it looked like type. But the notebook was not the only thing she brought. Edith had also carried, in a lidded tin that had once held lard, a collection of wheat seeds. Not any wheat, specific wheat. Red Fife, a heritage variety with origins in Scotland that had come through Mexico in the 1940s, adapting to the dry plateau climate before Edith's family crossed the border. Turkey Red, the hard winter wheat that Mennonite settlers had brought to Kansas in the 1870s. The variety that had once made the state's flour the standard against which every American bakery measured itself. White Sonora, an ancient soft wheat that predated industrialization by centuries, suited to the dry South Plains climate in a way that modern high-yield varieties were not. Edith grew small plots of all 3 on a corner of the leased land they worked, and she saved the seed each year and kept the notebook and made bread every Sunday. When Nora was 11, she sat at her grandmother's kitchen table in Kinsley and watched Edith crack a handful of Turkey Red between her palms and hold the split grain up to the window light, reading the kernel the way some people read a book. She said the berry tells you what it went through. You can see the protein in the color. Nora did not fully understand what that meant for another 15 years, but she did not forget it. Edith died in 2001. She left Nora the notebook and the tin of seeds, and a single handwritten sentence on an index card tucked inside the front cover. It said, "The wheat remembers things the soil forgot." Dale Pruitt was not the only person who found Nora's plan impractical. The agronomy community in Garfield County was not a large community, but it was a confident one. By 2009, the dominant system for small operator wheat in that part of Kansas had settled into a clear and well-articulated logic. Plant a high-yield certified variety, usually Everest or WB4458, apply the recommended nitrogen and fungicide schedule, deliver to the co-op elevator at harvest, and accept the commodity price. Dale's extension office had worksheets that modeled the whole thing, and the models showed modest but reliable margins if a grower stayed within the certified program. The system was not enriching anyone, but it was organized and it made sense in the way that any legible system makes sense to people who know how to read it. Nora was not growing certified varieties. She was growing red Fife and turkey red and white Sonora on 12 acres outside Burdett, on ground that she had not treated with synthetic nitrogen in 2 seasons, in rows that were deliberately thinner than the certified program recommended. Her yields per acre were substantially below county average. Dale had her numbers. The county average for hard red winter wheat in 2008 was 41 bushels per acre. Nora's heritage plots came in at 22. He had made this comparison in the Garfield County Cooperative meeting in February of 2009 in front of 23 growers and 3 board members, pointing at a projected table on the back wall of the VFW Hall in Ness City. "These are hobby yields," he said. "At commodity prices, this operation runs at a loss. I understand the sentiment. I understand there is a family connection here, but sentiment does not pay a mortgage." He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse, because it meant he believed it. He clicked to the next slide, which was a projected map of county planning data, and moved on to the spring outlook without pausing to see how the words had landed. The 23 growers in the room did not react visibly. Some of them looked at Nora. Some of them looked at the projector. Roy Mead, sitting in the second row, looked at his hands in his lap. Nora sat in the third row. She did not answer him in the meeting. She drove home in the February dark with the window cracked against the cold, the way she always drove when she was thinking through something she did not want to think through out loud. 2 weeks later, she signed the purchase agreement on the Kessler Mill. Let me tell you about stone milling, because the gap between what Dale measured and what Nora knew lived precisely in that process. Modern commercial flour milling is a steel roller operation. Steel rollers grind fast, run cool, and separate the wheat berries components so efficiently that the starchy endosperm comes off clean and white, and the bran and germ, which contain fats and oils, are removed because those fats go rancid and shorten shelf life. What you are left with is a stable, white, fast-rising flour that travels well and stores for months without degrading. This is not a conspiracy. It is an engineering solution to a real problem of scale, and it solved that problem precisely. Stone milling works differently. The French burr wheels in the Kessler mill turn slowly, at roughly 120 rotations per minute, against the 1,200 rotations of a modern steel roller. The slowness mattered. At low speed, the stones generated almost no heat, and the fats in the wheat germ did not separate cleanly from the flour. They stayed in. The bran stayed in. The resulting flour was gray cream in color, coarser in texture, and it smelled like the wheat it came from, something mineral and slightly sweet, the way a handful of good earth smells after rain. It had more protein, more fiber, more of the vitamins that the germ carried, and it had a flavor that roller-milled flour had not had for 100 years. The bakers who had been working with industrial flour their entire careers called it difficult. Heritage flour absorbed water differently. The dough handled differently. A sourdough starter fed on red Fife behaved almost like a different organism than one fed on commodity bread flour. The baker had to relearn timing, hydration, and proofing, and the learning curve was real and sometimes expensive. The bread was different in a way that anyone could taste. Nora spent the summer of 2009 cleaning the mill, not contracting the work out. She did it herself, with a brush and a bucket and a grain vacuum she rented from a farm supply store in Great Bend. The pigeons had been there for 15 years, and the evidence of that was everywhere. She worked the building from the rafters down, wearing a dust mask that fogged her glasses, and kneeling on boards that had not carried a person's weight since the last Kessler had walked out in 1994. 3 weeks in, she found a handwritten maintenance log tucked into a recess in the stone housing frame. The Kessler's own record of grinding dates and stone dressing intervals going back to 1923. She read through it by flashlight on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the mill floor with pigeon dust still on her jacket, and she brought it home and set it beside Edith's notebook on the kitchen table. She re-greased the stone mounting hardware with food-grade lubricant. She hired a millwright named Calvin Bowes, 61 years old and retired from a flour operation in Hutchinson, to assess the burr wheels and resurface the grinding faces, a process called dressing the stones, which Calvin did with a small chisel-faced hammer, striking the surface in a radial pattern to cut fresh furrows. Calvin worked for 2 days. He was not a man who explained himself in real time. He worked in silence and answered direct questions in short, declarative sentences, and did not ask what she planned to do with the mill once it ran again, because that, in his view, was not his part of the work. On the second afternoon, he ran his palm across the newly dressed face of the upper burr and held the hand up to the window light and looked at the stone dust on his skin. Calvin told her the stones were sound. He had not seen a 52-inch French burr set in that condition in 30 years. He said the Kesslers had cared for it. He said that was either a coincidence or a practice, and from the maintenance log she'd found, he thought it was a practice. The first test grind was in October 2009. Nora put 5 pounds of red fife through the mill, and the flour that came out the chute was the color of old cream, and it smelled the way her grandmother's kitchen had smelled on Sunday mornings in Kinsley. She sat down on the floor of the mill and ate a pinch of it raw. Calvin was still there, packing his tools. He looked at her on the floor and said nothing. He closed the latch on his tool case, said the dressing would hold for 18 months, and drove back to Hutchinson. Nora sat on the floor for a long time after his truck was gone. A neighbor of Nora's named Roy Mead had watched the mill purchase with the particular skepticism of a man who had farmed 320 acres in Garfield County for 27 years and had reason to be careful with his opinions about other people's decisions. Roy was not unkind. He had helped Nora repair the mill's loading dock in September, lending a truck and 2 hours without being asked. He was a compact, deliberate man in his mid-50s, known in the county for his diligence and for running one of the cleaner chemical programs in the extension system, which was a thing that mattered to him as a point of professional pride. He had financed a new John Deere combine in 2007, a purchase that made complete sense on paper at the time. The loan payment was $22,000 annually over 7 years. He had the yields in 2007 and 2008 to make the math work without losing sleep over it. Roy did not plant heritage varieties. He grew Everest on 280 acres, applied the full nitrogen and fungicide program, and delivered to the Nest City elevator. In 2009, he cleared 38 bushels per acre on his best ground. His operation was nothing like failing. It was, by the conventional measures, sound. He had a grain bin that held 45,000 bushels, a shop with a concrete floor, a water well that had never run dry. He attended the cooperative meeting in February 2009 and had not contradicted Dale Pruitt, because Dale Pruitt's numbers were not wrong. Roy's own operation was proof that the conventional model worked when the weather cooperated. He had based a $22,000 annual loan payment on that model and had no particular reason in February of 2009 to doubt it. The margin was thin, but it was there. He told Nora in that October, standing in her gravel lot, while she loaded sacks into her truck, that he admired what she was attempting. He used the word attempting carefully, the way you say it to someone you have decided to be kind to. By 2010, Nora had built a website, hand-typed on a borrowed laptop. She was selling 5-pound bags of stone-ground red fife and turkey red directly to home bakers at $6 a pound. The commodity price for hard red winter wheat in 2010 was roughly $5 per bushel, which worked out to about 9 cents a pound. Nora was charging 67 times the commodity rate. Dale Pruitt saw the website in late 2010 and called the county board chair to mention it. His note, which the board chair saved and later produced, described the pricing as a boutique retail experiment that will find its natural ceiling quickly. He was not wrong that there was a ceiling. He was wrong about where it was. Nora's daughter, Luce, who was 19 in 2010 and had enrolled in a business program at Fort Hays State, came home that Christmas and looked at the website and the order spreadsheet and told her mother she was leaving money on the table. Luz had 2 years of accounting coursework and 1 semester of marketing, and she carried her phone as though it contained all the information the world had generated since the invention of writing. She was not wrong that the operation was informal. She was not fully right about what it meant to be formal. You need a distributor, Luz said. You need SKUs. You need labeling compliance. You need to scale. Nora poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her daughter. What you need first, she said, is the wheat. It was not a speech. Nora was not given to speeches. She said it the way she said most things, at low volume, looking at her cup. And then she talked about the red fife crop for a few minutes in the specific technical language she had developed over 2 seasons, the protein percentage variation she was tracking between her different seed lineages, the soil structure changes she was seeing in her unsprayed plots, the way the root systems of the heritage varieties penetrated the subsoil differently than the Everest rose 2 fields over. Luz listened and understood some of it, and could not have told you afterward which parts she did not understand. She went back to Fort Hays in January, still unconvinced. In 2012, a baker named Renata Solis drove out from Wichita. She had read about Nora's flour in a small food publication that covered regional grain, and she had been baking professionally for 11 years, first in Wichita and then briefly in Chicago, and she knew what stone-ground flour smelled like because she had used it twice before, sourced from mills in Vermont and upstate New York, and she had wanted something closer. She drove 90 miles on a Tuesday morning in March without calling ahead, because she was the kind of person who preferred to see things as they were before they had been prepared for a visitor. She knocked on the mill door, and Nora let her in, and Renata stood at the base of the stone mill housing and ran her fingers across the burr surface that Calvin Bowes had dressed 3 years earlier. She had a chef's way of touching things, deliberate and absorptive, the same motion she used when pressing bread dough to test its structure. She was 42 years old, with hands that were stronger than they looked and dark eyes that moved in the efficient pattern of someone accustomed to reading the kitchen at a glance. "How slow do these run?" she said. 118 revolutions, Nora said. Renata was quiet for a moment. She crouched slightly and looked at the gap between the stones where the dressed furrows crossed. Then she straightened. "I want to smell the turkey red," she said. Nora put a half-pound sample in a paper bag. Renata opened the bag at the truck door, nose down, and was quiet for another long moment, long enough that a meadowlark called twice from the fence line across the road. She closed the bag and stood looking at the mill building. "What do you charge wholesale?" she said. "I don't have a wholesale structure," Nora said. "Build one," Renata said. "I'll buy everything you can mill." That was the first time Nora understood the word distribution in a way that connected to a physical reality she could affect. She did not call a consultant. She went home and opened Edith's notebook. If you are wondering what changed between 2009 and 2012, let me be specific. Nora had been doing something with her 12 acres that was almost invisible to anyone measuring in bushels per acre, which was the only unit Dale's extension models used. She'd been building soil. The heritage wheat varieties she planted had deeper root systems than modern high-yield varieties, and those roots, dying back each season, were adding organic matter to the subsoil. She had not tilled aggressively, which preserved the fungal networks in the soil structure. She had not applied synthetic nitrogen, which meant the soil biology was not being suppressed by the salt load that nitrogen fertilizer carries. After 4 seasons, her red Fife plot was on ground where the earthworm count per square foot had nearly doubled. A soil test she ran in 2012 showed organic matter at 3.8%. The county average for conventionally managed wheat ground in Garfield County that year was 1.9%. The organic matter percentage mattered in a way that was not on Dale's spreadsheet, because it did not directly translate to bushel yield. What it translated to was water retention. Ground with 3.8% organic matter holds more moisture per inch of rain than ground at 1.9%. In a normal year, this makes almost no difference to a measured yield. In a dry year, it is the difference between a crop that finishes and a crop that does not. 2012 was a dry year. It was more than dry. The summer of 2012 brought conditions that the National Drought Monitor classified as exceptional across most of the Kansas wheat belt, a designation that had applied to less than 3% of the state's agricultural land in the previous decade. By June, the heat index in Garfield County was running above 105 degrees on 10 consecutive days. The soil moisture deficit in the county's conventionally managed fields was severe. Everest, the high-yield variety that Roy Mead and most of Garfield County's commercial growers planted, was bred for yield under adequate moisture conditions. It was not bred for drought. Its shallow root system could not reach the subsoil moisture that the deeper root lines of heritage varieties accessed. Its dense planting, required to hit the certified yield models, meant each plant competed with its neighbors for what little water the topsoil held. Roy's 2012 harvest came in at 11 bushels per acre. The county average was 14. Some fields came in at 7 or 8. Nora's red Fife and turkey red plots came in at 18. In pounds of wheat per acre, Roy's 320 acres produced about 350,000 pounds. His loan payment on the 2007 combine was $19,000 annually. His input costs for 2012, seed, fuel, chemicals, and fertilizer, had been $81,000 for the season. At elevator price, 350,000 pounds of hard red winter wheat grossed roughly $96,000. After inputs and the loan payment, Roy Mead finished 2012 at a loss of approximately $4,000. Nora's 12 acres produced about 13,000 pounds of heritage wheat. At the wholesale price she and Renata had worked out, $6.50 per pound of finished flour, Nora grossed $84,000 from that single season, not counting the bag retail sales and the small restaurant accounts she had built in Wichita and one in Kansas City. Dale Pruitt attended the county cooperative meeting in November 2012. He stood at the same projector in the same VFW hall in Ness City and presented the drought analysis. His figures were careful and accurate. He noted that the county average yield loss had been substantial. He noted that some operators had fared better than others for reasons that included soil type, field elevation, and variety selection. He did not mention Nora Hatch by name. A grower in the back row, a woman named Addie Funk, who had been at the 2009 meeting, raised her hand and said, "What about the heritage varieties? I heard Hatch made out." Dale looked at his projector screen for a moment. "There are some operators," he said, "working in specialty grain markets that have insulation from commodity volatility. That's a different conversation than what we're reviewing tonight." It was not a different conversation. It was the same conversation with the answer in a different column. The winter of 2012 into 2013 was when Luce Hatch came home for good. She had finished her degree. She had taken a job briefly at an accounting firm in Salina and had lasted 11 months before she drove back to Burdett on a Thursday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and told her mother she wanted to understand the soil tests, not the business side first. The soil tests. Nora put the binder of tests on the table between the coffee cups, 2008 through 2012, each sheet in a plastic sleeve, the numbers written by the testing lab in Pratt in a small font that Luce had to lean in to read. The organic matter column went from 2.1% in 2008 to 3.8% in 2012, a steady climb, 1 decimal point at a time, 4 years of root mass and restraint, building something that would not appear on any yield table. Luce sat with the binder for a long time. Then she said, "You knew 2012 was coming." "Not that year specifically," Nora said, "but something like it." This was the difference between the two kinds of knowing that Dale's extension model could not accommodate. Dale knew the county averages. He knew the certified variety yield tables and the nitrogen response curves and the fungicide efficacy data from replicated university trials. That knowledge was real and it was valuable, and it had been correct in the aggregate for 2 decades of reasonably adequate rainfall. What it could not do was account for a place in a dry year, one specific 12-acre parcel on County Road 14 in Garfield County, whose soil had been rebuilding for 4 seasons because one woman had trusted a system she had watched her grandmother run in a kitchen in Kinsley. Luce stayed. She built the distribution system her mother had not wanted to build alone. She established the wholesale pricing schedule, the SKUS, the labeling, the food safety certification that the Wichita restaurants needed for their ordering systems. She kept the seed program going through Nora, tracking the lineages, saving from the strongest plants each season. By 2015, they were milling 22 acres of heritage wheat and selling to 11 wholesale bakery accounts, 4 of them outside Kansas. Dale Pruitt drove out to the mill in March of 2016. He called ahead this time. He arrived in his white University Fleet pickup, which was newer than the one he had driven in 2009, and he parked in the lot and came in through the mill door and stood under the timber frame, looking up at the 52-inch stone set with an expression that Nora would later describe to Luce as calculating, the way a person looks at a problem they are not sure they were right about. He had a legal pad, which he did not open immediately. He stood under the housing for a moment before he said anything at all. He asked about the soil testing schedule. He asked about the protein percentages Nora tracked between lineages, and when she told him the red fife from her oldest seed line was running at 15% protein against the commodity Everest average of 11, he wrote the numbers in the margin rather than the center of his legal pad, as though he were not certain where they belonged yet. He asked about the milling speed and the temperature of the flour at the outlet chute. The temperature mattered, for a reason he stated precisely. The germ fats that stone milling retained would degrade rapidly if heat was introduced during the grinding process, and the consistent low speed of the French burr set held the outlet temperature to 61 degrees even in a heavy grinding cycle. He had looked this up before he came. Nora could tell by the specificity of the question. He asked questions for 45 minutes. He wrote things down in a way that was different from the clipboard in 2009. In 2009, the clipboard had been a tool for confirmation. The legal pad in 2016 was a tool for understanding. Near the end, he said, "I told the cooperative meeting in 2009 that this was a hobby." "I remember," Nora said. "I was working from the commodity model," he said. "That model doesn't have a slot for what the soil was doing." He was not a man who found the admission easy. Nora could see that. He looked at the legal pad while he said it. It was not quite an apology, and it was not nothing. It was a sincere man updating a calculation in real time and finding that the update did not flatter him. Nora did not need it to be more than that. She poured him a cup of coffee and showed him the 2015 soil tests, which put the organic matter at 4.4%, and showed him the fungal network photographs that a soil scientist from Emporia State had taken the previous summer, the white mycelial threads branching through the core sample, like a river system seen from altitude. The photograph was mounted on a foam board that Luce had made for a farmer's market display and never put back in its sleeve. He took a photograph of the foam board with his phone. He asked if he could share it with the extension office. She said yes. The spring of 2019 brought a frost event in late April that killed a significant portion of the Everest crop across central Kansas, coming 2 weeks after the plants had broken dormancy and extended into full growth. Modern high-yield varieties time their growth to the average last frost date. In a statistically normal year, this is rational. In 2019, the average was not what arrived. Roy Mead lost 60% of his planted acres. The county average for winter wheat yield in 2019 in Garfield County was 23 bushels per acre, the lowest since records began. Nora's heritage wheat had not lost 60%. The turkey red and red fife varieties she grew had come through continental Europe and the Great Plains over 2 centuries, and the seed that Edith had carried north in a lard tin had descended from plants that had survived late freezes many times before. The dormancy trigger in heritage varieties was calibrated differently than in modern certified lines. They broke dormancy more slowly. They were less eager in early warm spells. This was not a defect the breeders had tried to eliminate. It was a trait so old it had no modern name in the certified variety catalog. In April 2019, Nora lost 8% of her planted acres to the frost. By June, when the scope of the statewide crop damage had become visible and the commodity markets began reacting to the supply reduction, Nora and Luce were looking at a wait list of 64 bakery accounts who had found them through the distribution network Luce had spent 4 years building. They were milling 31 acres by then. Still every pound grown on land they managed themselves. Still every bag packed at the mill. In September 2019, a food writer named Marcus Cho from the Kansas City Star drove out on a Tuesday. He had been writing about regional grain for 3 years and had heard Renata Solis mentioned the Kessler Mill twice in different interviews. He spent 4 hours at the property, walking the fields with Luss while Nora ran a grinding cycle. And he published a piece in October that ran with a photograph of the stone mill housing and the headline the editors had chosen, which Nora had not seen before it appeared. The piece ran on a Thursday. By Monday morning, Luz had 47 new wholesale inquiry emails. The orders that came in that fall and winter were different in kind from the restaurant accounts they had been managing. These were wholesale buyers, regional distributors, specialty grocery chains. They asked for quantities that the mill's current capacity could not supply. Luz handled every email herself at first, then hired a part-time assistant. She turned down every order above what the acreage could reliably produce. She explained without apology that the mill ran what the ground grew, and the ground grew what the seed and the soil between them had built over 11 years. A buyer from a regional food distributor in Kansas City named Hartwell Foods visited in November 2019. He arrived in a clean sedan and wore a pressed jacket and carried a clipboard in a way that made Nora look at him once, sharply, and then look away. His name was Gord, and he was 48 years old, and had been buying specialty grains for 17 years, and he was not given to sentiment about the products he purchased. He tasted the red fife flour at the mill outlet chute, a small pinch held in his palm and then tasted on his tongue, and he was quiet for long enough that Luss thought he might have forgotten he was there to make a commercial inquiry. "Who else is selling you?" he said finally. "Nobody sells us," Luz said. "We sell." He looked at the stone housing. He looked at the flour sample in his palm. "What do you need to supply a standing order?" he said. "How much are you asking for?" Luz said. "Start with 5,000 pounds a month," he said. "Monthly, locked." Luz did not look at her mother. She knew what the answer was because she had done the math on the mill capacity 2 years earlier and had left 3 decimal places of precision in the spreadsheet. She said they could supply 4,000 pounds a month on a locked order at $8.50 per pound, with a 12-month contract and a 90-day advance payment on the first quarter. Gord was quiet. He looked at the stone housing again. "Done," he said. In January 2023, Hartwell Foods placed the 11,000-pound order. They had renegotiated the contract twice in 3 years as Nora and Luz expanded to 44 acres and hired 2 part-time mill hands, both women from the Burdett area who learned the dressing process from Calvin Bose before he retired in 2021. The waiting list of 32 bakeries that January was Luz's project. She had been working it systematically, communicating with each account about projected availability and the expansion timeline. Dale Pruitt read the Marcus Cho piece when it appeared in 2019 and called the mill to ask if he could bring 2 extension staff members out for a site visit. Nora said yes. The visit was in February 2020, and Dale brought a soil scientist named Petra and a grain agronomist named Webb, and the 3 of them spent a morning in the fields with core samplers and a morning in the mill. Dale asked if Nora would be willing to participate in a field day event that summer where extension staff could present the heritage variety soil health data alongside conventional variety comparisons. She said she would. She asked that they present her yields in pounds of flour revenue per acre rather than bushels per acre, because the bushel comparison was not the unit that told the true story. Webb agreed. Petra agreed. Dale wrote it down. The field day happened in August 2020. 41 growers attended. 8 of them followed up with Nora for seed. By 2022, Nora had sold or traded heritage wheat seed to 19 growers in 5 counties. Not all of them were converting entirely. Some were running 2 or 3 acres alongside their certified program, learning the differences in handling and timing before they committed more ground. Roy Mead had 2 acres of turkey red in 2021. He called Nora in October of that year when he harvested it, in a tone that was careful and specific. He said the per-acre revenue from those 2 acres, sold through her wholesale channel, had cleared more than the full margin from his best 40 acres of Everest. He asked if she could sell him more seed. She had enough for 10 acres. She sold it to him at cost. The tin that Edith Vargas had carried north in 1952 sat on a shelf in the mill office above the desk where Luce kept the order ledgers. It had been emptied of its original contents in 2007 when Nora planted the last of the original red fife seed from that tin and began growing her own saved population. The tin itself was still there. Nora had set it on the shelf the morning she planted that last seed, and it had stayed there through every season since, through the mill renovation and the drought and the frost and the orders that came faster than the ground could answer them. In the spring of 2023, Luce drove to Fort Hays and spoke to 40 students in an agricultural economics course at her mother's invitation, the professor having read the Cho piece and extended the offer. She brought a bag of flour and a 1-page summary of the soil test data from 2008 to 2022, and she talked for an hour about organic matter percentages and wholesale pricing structures and the difference between a yield model and a revenue model. A student asked her at the end what made the flour taste different. Luce thought about this for a moment. "The stone runs slow," she said. "Everything that's in the wheat is still in the flour." She paused. "The wheat remembers what the soil learned," she said, "if you give it enough time." At the end of the semester, 2 students from that class drove out to Burdett on a Saturday. One of them wanted to see the mill, the other wanted to buy seed. Nora handed the tin off the shelf and set it on the desk between her and the 2 students, and she opened the lid, and inside was a small paper envelope of red fife seed from the 2022 harvest, which she had put there the fall before with no specific plan. She gave the envelope to the one who wanted seed and told her to keep a quarter of whatever it produced for her own planting the following year. There is a version of what Nora Hatch did that Dale Pruitt's extension model will eventually capture in a revised variety comparison chart, in a soil health metric added to the annual field survey, in a heritage grain pilot program that the university is currently funding with a 3-year grant. That version is real and useful. But it is not the whole story. The whole story is that a woman bought a failing mill nobody wanted with $38,000 she had spent a decade saving. And she did it because her grandmother had told her the wheat remembers, and she had believed that without being able to explain it in units that a spreadsheet would accept. She grew wheat with roots that went deeper than the county average's expectations. She ground it on stones that ran slow enough to leave the germ intact. She built soil for 11 years before anyone measured it in a unit that connected to money. She waited for the dry year and the late frost, and the market that would come when people who baked for a living began to taste the difference between flour that had forgotten what it was and flour that had not. What the efficient system measures and what the land actually produces are 2 different things. They are not always different by much. In a normal year, under adequate rainfall and stable markets, the difference is a matter of decimal points and premiums. In a dry year, in a late frost year, in the year the market finally learns to ask a different question, the difference is the thing that keeps you there. The stones at the Kessler Mill run at 118 revolutions per minute. They have run at that speed since 1911, except for the years they stood still. They are running now. What is rigid breaks. What is slow and deep and calibrated to one particular piece of ground tends to outlast the projections made by people who have never touched that ground. That is not sentiment. It is soil science and market data and 44 acres of turkey, red and red fife, standing in a Kansas field in January, green under a gray sky, remembering every drought that has tried to finish them, and every season that failed. Edith Vargas knew this. She wrote it down on an index card and tucked it inside the front cover of the notebook. Nora read it when she was 11 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in Kinsley, watching her grandmother hold a split kernel up to the window light. The tin is still on the shelf,